Welcome to our virtual Justice on the Block Legal Information Clinic. This clinic is part of the virtual series, Know Your Child's Education Rights. This session, we will be talking about transitioning from early childhood to school special education services. I am Stephanie Johnson, and I'm the managing attorney in the Tallahassee Office of Legal Services in North Florida. And with me is Cheryl Sadler. She is our education advocate with Legal Services. I have a quick housekeeping note. So this video provides legal information and should not be considered legal advice. This video does not create an attorney-client relationship or a substitute for legal advice you've already been given. You may have defenses that we haven't discussed here, so seeking out an attorney for legal help is always advisable. For more information about legal services in North Florida, you can go to www.lsnf.org or call 850-385-9007. So thank you for joining us. So Cheryl, we usually talk about special education as something that happens in K through 12 public schools, but it's not limited to schools or to school-aged children, correct?
That is absolutely right. And you're right, we don't often think about it, but every state, including Florida, of course, has an obligation to locate every child who needs special education services. And that obligation actually starts at birth. We call this the child find mandate, right? We have to find the child. And for many children with disabilities, it's really important to get that early start addressing those disabilities. It makes a lot of difference. So a child can actually enter special education as early as birth and as late as age 21.
So how does Child Find work with young children?
That's a great question. Of course, they're not in school, so we don't expect schools to find them. So here in Florida, we actually have two programs. The first is for very young children, birth through 3. It's called Early Steps, which makes a lot of sense. So Early Steps is run by the Department of Health, and it serves children who have or are at risk for developmental disabilities or delays, which is a mouthful. So there's two ways to get to Early Steps. So first, a parent can always contact Early Steps. And just for the record, we have a bunch of resources at the end of this video or that are in the chat. So you don't have to worry about going and finding Early Steps, for example. So if a parent thought their child was not meeting developmental milestones, and that's a mouthful too. So we have a link to a video that talks about that. Then they can go to Early Steps and ask for an assessment. The most typical way, though, is that a professional refers a parent to Early Steps, a doctor, a pediatrician, a nurse, someone that the child is interacting with for some other reason. And then once that referral is made, the Early Steps people test the child in several areas, and those are physical, cognitive, communication, social, emotional, and adaptive skills. And I am not a psychiatrist. I can't explain those, but it has a lot to do with things like your child might not be crawling when they should start to crawl, or perhaps they can't grasp objects. Perhaps they don't make eye contact. Maybe they aren't talking or sending things out when a doctor thinks typically a child should. So things like that.
Okay.
I want to tell you a little bit about that program and what it looks like, and then we'll talk about the second program, which is for kids who are 4 and older.
So what is special education with young children like?
Right. So, and this is really the really important thing to understand, because if you're a parent and you're making a transition from early childhood services to school services, they look very different. And if you have an older child who's already in school services, again, these look very different. So for very young children, everything is about the family. So families get an ISFIP, an individualized service plan, and services are pushed in. They're provided where the child is. It could be their pre-K setting. It could be in daycare. It could be in the home. it's very much about developmentally appropriate learning activities and opportunities being part of the child's everyday life. And then when the child starts getting a little older at 4, things start to look a little bit more like school. So Florida actually has a pre-K. It's the same as voluntary pre-K, VPK, but it's specifically for children with disabilities. And that's for kids who are 4 to 9. It does get a little complicated because, you can still have a referral from your pediatrician or whatever, but a lot of times instead, it's a parent who reaches out to a school district. And it seems like very young, right? I've got a 4-year-old. Why am I talking to the school district? But that's just the person who knows how to get you to an organization with a really crazy name. We call it Fiddlers because it's so crazy. It's the Florida Diagnostic and Learning Resources System. And like, who says that in a sentence? And the same thing basically takes place once you get to Fiddlers. They do a test, and these are little tests. These are not like you sit down for 2 hours with a paper and a pencil. These are little tasks. And then children are eligible if they have delays. And so delay is they're not making those milestones in the same timeline that you would expect, in 5 different areas. And so it's the same areas: adaptive development, which is self-help, um, holding a glass, buttoning a shirt, things like that; cognitive development, communication development, social or emotional development. Can they share? Can they take turns? And then physical development, which can be things like fine motor skills, gross motor skills, or perceptual motor skills. So it's a pretty wide area, and it's intended to be very broad, as we want to get kids on the right path. And so the program is run by each school district, and because it's by the school district, you don't see very much family involvement. You're not looking at realistic, play environments. You're looking at school.
So it sounds like at age 4 is when you're going to see this transition from the family-based services to the education system.
That's exactly right. So even though a 4-year-old is still very young, the services shift very much from the family to the school. And then the next big shift is from general developmental delays to things that have specifically to do with learning. So it gets narrower and much more specific.
And what are some of the key differences between these two sections?
I think I probably already previewed this a little bit, but we're looking for services that are not in a natural environment. There's nothing natural about a school environment. Nobody sees desks just spontaneously on sidewalks, right? That's very school-like. And then also, and this doesn't take place right away, but as a child ages and gets further and further into the school system, particularly when you get to about the end of 2nd grade, it's very much on academic achievement, and then the behavioral and social skills that are related to learning. So those might have to do with self-control. Can you sit in a chair? Can you listen quietly? Can you follow directions? Can you share? Can you interact with an adult appropriately? The other thing that I think parents really need to be aware of is that the younger the child, the more the system is designed to help you as a parent. So they come sit with you, they talk with you, they sit in your living room, they play with your child together. But once you get to VPK, again, it's all about school. And we actually, because there's so many differences and they can feel a little abrupt, we put together a chart just to help you compare the differences. And, I think it's a little unfortunate. And I think all families who have children who struggle need support. And it's much more difficult to get that as your child is older, even though sometimes the problems are more complicated. So we will include a link to that comparison chart.
Great. And hasn't there been some recent legislation that has changed some of the eligibility issues?
That legislation was passed um, in part because it is very fuzzy when you're young. And uh, there's a category called developmental delay that basically encompasses all this stuff that we've been talking about. And in 2022, so just this last year, the legislature made that category. It used to end at age 5, and now it ends at age 9. And basically, what that means is if your child is struggling with some of these things, even though they don't have a specific diagnosis from a doctor, like autism, for example, that would make them eligible for special education, they can still be eligible based on this kind of more amorphous, harder to define category of a developmental delay. It gives schools some flexibility and parents some flexibility in serving kids who may have some of these more generalized needs.
So if you have a child that is very delayed, say in speech or maybe social skills, but the parents have not got a firm diagnosis of why that is from a doctor, this will allow the schools to continue to provide services under this broad category of developmental delay.
Yes, that's exactly the idea. And I should just mention that it's very hard to diagnose a very young child. There are tests that you can do, but kids' minds are still growing and developing, and so we know that we might make some good guesses, but they're not always 100% spot on.
Mhm. So what is your best advice for parents?
I think I could sum this up as don't worry about being annoying. Keep asking questions until you understand. So Florida has all kinds of organizations who are specifically funded to help parents. And so they have early learning coalitions, which are responsible for services to young children. There's about 30 all over Florida, and we have a link on how to find yours. And because they are in the day to day business of educating young kids, they have heard every question there is. So, you are not asking a dumb question. There is no dumb question when it comes to your child. They can answer all kinds of questions about typical development. The people at Fiddlers, which we talked about before, are experts in special education and in assessment. And, sometimes people get in a hurry, right? We all are busy. And I think everybody knows what I know, and you may think everybody knows what you know. So we don't always take the time that we need to explain. But all of these folks, the Early Learning Coalition, Early Steps, Fiddlers, they are paid to help parents. So these are important services. They can be critical to a child, and parents deserve to understand what's happening and what to expect. So just keep asking questions. The one other thing that I would add is when you're asking questions, ask if there's a local support group for parents so that you can talk to other parents, because sometimes they know how to say things in ways that make much more sense than people who are, you know, this is what they do for a living. And parents have walked in your shoes, and there's nothing like talking to somebody who really gets it.
Yeah, and Cheryl and I have been doing this for a long time, and we know that it's the parent that asks the questions over and over and over again that will get the most benefits for their children. So, like Cheryl said, just don't be afraid to be too assertive. You can never be too assertive when you're dealing with the school system or with early childhood services. So, that's very good advice. All right. And like Cheryl said, we're going to have a lot of links at the end of this video. And so take a screenshot of them, whatever you need to do to save them. And those will be very helpful to you. So thank you very much, Cheryl.
I did want to just on, I think everything you said, I 100% agree with. There's actually in the law a requirement that parents be involved. So schools can't do anything without a parent. And you're absolutely right. It's the parent that asks that gets the services. But, not only do you deserve information, they're required to make sure that you are thoroughly involved. And so you have a place at that table.
Great. Thank you. Until next time.